It's hard to believe that it's almost time for Holy Week already. It doesn't seem like next Sunday should be Palm Sunday already, but it is. And Easter is just around the corner. But before we have Easter, we have a few more stops to take, because to get to Easter, you have to go through Good Friday. And that brings us to today's gospel, where Jesus is talking about, well, some pretty scary, uncomfortable, and unpleasant things. Usually these passages get read as talking about something in the far away from now times. You've got Jesus talking about the destruction of the temple, which happens in 70 AD, along with another, disaster of biblical proportions, Old Testament, real wrath of God type stuff. Fire and brimstone coming down from the skies, rivers and seas boiling, 40 years of darkness, earthquakes, volcanoes, the dead rising from the grave, human sacrifice, gods and dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria. Oh, sorry, that was the events of the first Ghostbusters movie. I got a little confused there. See, as Jesus points us to the end of the age, something that gets expanded on in the book of Revelation, it's a time when, even though there is chaos, we know that God is ultimately channeling his inner Belinda Carlisle and telling us that heaven is a place that comes to earth. Recreating heaven and earth together as a new perfect place where there isn't sickness, death, pain, crying, or any of the things that disrupt the perfect peace that this world was intended to be. But what if the end times isn't all that's Jesus talking about here? What if there's something a little bit more imminent that Jesus is also talking about when he mentions all these things that's going to happen? When it comes to prophecies in the Bible, I tend to think that they have more than one fulfillment. A prophecy that comes up might be fulfilled in one way at one time and then fulfilled in another way in another time. Many of the prophecies that we usually read as being about Jesus in the Old Testament were also relevant to the Old Testament time in which they were prophesied. So it's not a huge leap to think, okay, maybe Jesus is talking about more than one thing here. Of course, it also makes life quite a bit more complex, but complex can be fun. So what if, instead of just talking about Jesus' second coming and the creation of a new heaven and new earth, what if he's also talking about his first coming and the new covenant he's about to establish with God's people? Now, I'm going to kind of ignore the faraway implications of this with Jesus' second coming, because we've probably all heard this passage preached that way before, so no sense in reinventing the wheel. I want to touch, though, on these nearer term implications of what Jesus is saying, especially the bit about the temple. Because what if Jesus here isn't just talking about the building of the temple, but he's talking about himself? If you remember at Jesus' trial, one of the things that he's accused of is saying that he's going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. Now, if you're looking for something that was destroyed and rebuilt in 3 days, Jesus is one of those things. On Good Friday, he dies. 3 days later, by Hebrew counting, if you get part of a day, you get the whole day. So 3 days later, on Sunday, he is risen. So that was practice. Remember this for 2 weeks from now. If you do that bad on Easter, I'm going to be sorely disappointed. So when Jesus says that in 3 days, or when the witnesses testifying against Jesus say that in 3 days the temple will be rebuilt, the things that are said in the mouths of these false witnesses actually give some sense to this idea that maybe Jesus is talking about more than just some far future events. The next is a quote that Jesus uses from the Old Testament that sounds like a lot of quotes in the Old Testament that talk about something that's somewhat ambiguously called the day of the Lord. Now, the day of the Lord is a big thing in the Old Testament, and it's something either really good happens on the day of the Lord or something really bad happens on the day of the Lord. Nothing mediocre happens on the day of the Lord. It's always very good or very bad, never in the middle. And it uses language like, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the sky, the heavenly bodies will be shaken. It's reminiscent of some passages in Isaiah, some passages in Joel, all other kinds of places that talk about a shaking of the very foundations of the world. What is more shaking to the world than the death of God? That's what happened when Jesus was crucified, right? If Jesus is fully God and he was fully dead, God died. Crazy to think about, right? Because in that moment, Jesus died on the cross, taking on the sin of the world. The Trinity itself is stretched apart because for the first time, the Father and Son are separated by sin. It hurts. Like, I can barely understand the Trinity, let alone the Trinity being torn apart by sin and then put back together by the resurrection and pooh. But it's a world-shattering event. Something that flips everything upside down. Something that sounds like a day of the Lord. And then Jesus talks about the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. Usually that's pretty obvious, but consider this. In John's gospel, right before Jesus gets arrested, he says, "Now is the Son of Man glorified." Not when he's going up for the ascension does he say that, but as he's getting ready to be arrested, go on trial, and be executed, he says, "Now is the Son of Man glorified." Now we know from Philippians that Paul writes that it is through the cross, through Jesus' submission to the cross, that he gets his glory. That Jesus was exalted to the highest place in heaven and on earth because he humbly submitted to the cross. And then, of course, there's this one line that Jesus says at the end of this discussion that says, "This generation will not pass away until all these things have happened." Now, if that's talking about some far future event, that causes a whole slew of problems. Because we know that many of the people that were standing around Jesus hearing this died. We have record of them dying. It's not something that we have to guess about. But if Jesus is talking about the crucifixion, as well as these far future events, that makes that line make sense. Because the people standing around listening to Jesus talking about him going to the cross, that they were all around for. When Jesus goes to the cross, he does something so new and so different that it takes some explanation for his disciples to get it. And it all points to something Jesus does 2 days after this preaching, on the night in which he was betrayed, when he takes the bread and cup from the Passover meal and tells his disciples, "This is my body. This is the blood of the new covenant for the forgiveness of your sins." Jesus is offering himself to God's people, bringing about a new covenant that fulfills the old covenant entirely. And he's giving the people a new law, one that's not based in ritual and sacrifice, but is focused on love. As we talked about last week, all these big events that Jesus talks about in the gospel, talking about the world being turned upside down, is something that he does in his death and resurrection. The world gets turned around, and a new age is being ushered in, one with love at its center. Love of God and neighbor expressed fully in Jesus on the cross for all of us.